My name is Elena Marsh. I am 37 years old, and by the time my stepmother scheduled my father's will reading for a Tuesday morning, she knew I couldn't easily take off work. I already understood she was hoping I simply wouldn't show up at all. I showed up anyway. "She's not in the will, so she gets nothing," Diane announced to the room before I had even taken off my coat, loud enough for my father's cousins, his old business partner, and the family attorney to hear. No one corrected her. My brother Tyler nodded slowly, the way he always did when he wanted to seem thoughtful instead of complicit. "That's fair," he said. "Elena moved out years ago. Dad and Diane built this life together." I set my coffee down on the lawyer's conference table and said calmly, "The house isn't his to give. It's mine." The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Diane laughed first, a short, disbelieving sound. Tyler looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. A cousin near the window lowered his phone slightly, as if he'd been about to record the reading as a formality, and had just realized it might become something else entirely. Before I tell you what the lawyer said next, and why his face changed color when he opened his own file, and what he found buried 3 folders deeper that had nothing to do with the will at all, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from, and where in the world are you right now? I want to know how far a quiet reckoning can travel, because the will my father signed 8 months before he died was never going to matter as much as Diane thought. Not once someone finally read the deed, and not once someone finally asked where 15 years of shared money had actually gone. My father, Robert Marsh, spent 31 years restoring and renting out old farmhouses across 3 counties. He was patient with buildings and impatient with people, which meant he was easy to admire from a distance and difficult to know up close. He measured affection in labor. If he replastered your ceiling or rebuilt your porch steps without being asked, that was him telling you he loved you. He was never going to say the words out loud, and for most of my childhood I didn't need him to. My mother died when I was 19, quickly, from an illness none of us saw coming. My father grieved the way he did everything else, privately, methodically, and by throwing himself into work. 2 years later, he married Diane Foster, a woman who understood exactly how to make herself indispensable to a grieving man without ever once being asked to prove it. Diane was, by any outside measure, impressive. She redecorated the house my father had built with his own hands and made it look like something out of a magazine. She learned the names of his clients, his suppliers, his old army friends, and made sure each of them left every gathering feeling personally flattered. She hosted. She organized. She made herself the center of gravity in a family that had been quietly orbiting grief for 2 years. And for a while I was grateful to her for it. Tyler, 4 years younger than me and still in high school when she arrived, adapted to Diane quickly and completely. He called her mom within the first year. I never did, and Diane treated that as evidence of a coldness in me, rather than a boundary I was allowed to have. She used to tell people gently, almost affectionately, that I needed time, as though my grief for my actual mother was a personality flaw she was patiently managing. I didn't move away because I stopped loving my father. I moved away because every visit home became a performance I was expected to give a good review of afterward. Diane redirected conversations toward herself with a skill that bordered on artistry. If I mentioned a promotion at work, she'd pivot within 2 sentences to a story about her own early career, delivered with just enough self-deprecation to seem humble. If I brought up my mother, even in passing, Diane's face would do something complicated and hurt, and my father would quietly ask me afterward to be more sensitive. Tyler agreed with whatever kept the peace. He always had. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was simply the kind of person who mistook the absence of conflict for the presence of harmony. And Diane had figured out early on that all she needed from him was agreement, not loyalty. What none of them knew was that my father and I had never actually stopped talking. We simply stopped talking in front of Diane, every few weeks for the last 6 years of his life. My father drove out to see me under the excuse of checking on a property nearby. We'd sit in my kitchen, and it was the only version of my family life that ever felt honest. He'd ask about my work as a structural inspector, a job he was quietly, fiercely proud of, though he rarely said so directly. I'd ask about his knees, his blood pressure, whether he was still climbing ladders at 68, that he had no business climbing. It was ordinary, and it was ours. 3 years before he died, my father told me he was worried. Diane had begun asking pointed questions about the farmhouse, not the shared house they lived in together, but the original property he'd bought decades earlier, before he ever met her, the one that had passed through some form of Marsh family ownership since his own grandfather's time. He'd restored it himself over the better part of a decade. New foundation, rewired electrical, a roof he'd replaced twice. It wasn't just a building to him. It was the one thing in his life that had nothing to do with anyone's approval. Diane had started describing that farmhouse, in front of guests, as our retirement project, as though her involvement had quietly backdated itself into the deed. She'd mentioned more than once that once Robert slowed down, they'd sell the marital home and move into the farmhouse full-time, or perhaps subdivide the land, or perhaps let a developer make an offer. My father never agreed to any of it out loud. He also never told her no, because telling Diane no in front of an audience always cost him more than it was worth. "I don't want that house to become a bargaining chip," he told me that day, turning a coffee mug slowly on my kitchen table, not quite looking at me. "I don't want it split, sold, or argued over the moment. I'm not here to stop it." There was a specific incident that pushed him toward action, one he told me about almost a year later, sitting in that same chair. Diane had invited a real estate developer to what she called a casual dinner, and spent the evening describing the farmhouse's acreage, its road frontage, its potential subdivision value, while my father sat at the head of the table saying nothing, watching a stranger discuss dismantling the one thing he'd built entirely for himself. When he brought it up to Diane afterward, gently, she told him he was being paranoid, that she was simply keeping their options open, and that he should be grateful. Someone in the marriage still thought about the future. That was the night he called. His own attorney. Not the family attorney Diane was. Used to dealing with a different one. A man named Preston Hale, referred to him by an old army friend. And that was the week he called me and asked if I'd come with him to sign something. 5 years before his death, my father transferred the farmhouse into a joint ownership arrangement with me, a deed with right of survivorship, filed and recorded at the county registrar's office under both our names only. It meant that the moment he died, the house would pass to me automatically. Outside of any will, outside of probate, outside of anything a court or a family argument could later touch. He never told Diane. He never told Tyler. He told Preston. And he told me. And the three of us sat in Preston's small office on a Thursday afternoon, while I signed a document I only half understood the weight of at the time. "It's not a punishment," my father said afterward, more than once over the following years, almost like he was reassuring himself as much as me. "It's a promise. You're the one who never asked me for anything, your whole life. I want the one thing that's actually entirely mine to go to the one person who never once tried to take it from me." I didn't fight him on it. I also didn't bring it up at family dinners, because I understood exactly what would happen if I did. It would become a grievance. It would become proof, in Diane's telling, that I was scheming, manipulating a vulnerable old man, driving a wedge into a happy marriage. It would become a story she repeated at Thanksgiving for years. So I let the paperwork exist quietly in a filing cabinet in my own home, the way my father wanted, and I waited, hoping the day I'd need it was still a long way off. It wasn't. My father passed in early spring, after a short illness that Diane managed with the same practiced composure she managed everything. Flowers arranged, guest book signed, obituary, written in a way that mentioned her contributions to their home twice, and my name once, in a list of survivors, sandwiched between a nephew and a family friend. I gave the eulogy anyway. I talked about the farmhouse, about ladders he shouldn't have been climbing, about a man who said "I love you" with a hammer instead of his mouth. Diane cried beautifully in the front row. Tyler held her hand. I stood at the podium and understood, for the first time with total clarity, exactly how thoroughly I had been written out of the story of my own family. Long before any will was ever read, the will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Diane chose the date, the time, and the attorney's office. Her attorney, not my father's, not Preston. I only found out about it because Tyler texted me the address the night before, almost as an afterthought. The way you'd text someone the address of a dentist appointment they'd forgotten to write down. I almost didn't go. Then I remembered the filing cabinet in my hallway closet, and I decided I wanted to watch this happen in person. Diane's will reading was efficient and rehearsed, the way everything Diane organized tended to be. My father's will, drafted years earlier and technically still valid, left the majority of his liquid assets and his half of the shared marital home to Diane, a modest portion to Tyler, and a single line acknowledging me with a sum small enough to look generous on paper and nowhere near enough to matter in practice. Diane read the farmhouse into that same pool of assets, listing it among the estate's holdings as though it had always belonged to the marital estate, as though a decade of solitary restoration and a lifetime of family history simply evaporated the moment she said the word our. That's when she made her announcement about me getting nothing, and Tyler agreed, and I set my coffee down and told them the house wasn't my father's to give. The attorney, a man named Preston Hale, the same Preston, sitting across the table from Diane's own attorney, a coincidence Diane clearly hadn't accounted for when she chose her venue, opened the folder in front of him and went quiet for a long moment. "Ms. Marsh," he said carefully, glancing at me with something that looked almost like recognition. "Are you referring to a specific document?" "The deed," I said. "Joint ownership, right of survivorship, filed with the county 5 years ago. My name and my father's name only." Diane's smile didn't move at first, but something behind her eyes did. "That's not possible. Robert would have told me something like that." "He didn't have to tell you," I said. "It wasn't yours to be told about." Preston excused himself, made a call to the county registrar's office from the hallway, and came back 11 minutes later looking like a man who just realized his morning was going to be considerably longer than planned. "The deed is legitimate," he said, sliding a printed copy across the table so everyone could see it. "Recorded, notarized, unchallenged for 5 years. The farmhouse passed to Ms. Marsh automatically at the moment of her father's death. It was never part of the estate this will controls. It hasn't been legally for 5 years." Diane's face did something I had never once seen it do in 16 years of knowing her. It stopped performing. Tyler was the first to recover. "This has to be some kind of mistake. Dad wouldn't cut Diane out of the house she's lived near for 15 years. "He didn't cut her out of anything she owned," I said. "She never owned that house. She lived near it, visited it occasionally, and described it at dinner parties as an investment. There's a difference, Tyler, and apparently I was the only one in this family who ever understood it." Diane's composure cracked into something colder, something I recognized from years of watching her manage confrontation. "You manipulated a dying man." "He wasn't dying when we filed it," I said. "He was healthy, sitting at my kitchen table, worried that the one thing his grandfather built with his own hands was going to get carved up in a bargaining chip argument the moment he wasn't there to stop it. He was right to worry. We're watching it happen right now." That was when Preston, still holding his own folder closed against his chest, said something that made the room go quiet all over again, in a completely different way. "There's something else," he said, looking at Diane rather than at me. "Given today's disclosure, I have a professional obligation to flag an inconsistency I noticed while preparing the full estate inventory last week. Several transfers were made from Robert's personal investment account into an account solely in Diane's name over the 18 months prior to his death. Approximately $210,000 in total. I haven't been able to locate written authorization from Robert for any of them." Diane's own attorney, seated beside her, put a hand briefly on her arm, the universal gesture for stop talking. "That's absurd," Diane said anyway. "I managed our household finances. That's what wives do." Robert trusted me completely. "Managing finances and retitling them into a separate account are different things," Preston said evenly. "I'll need documentation showing Robert's informed consent for each of these transfers, dated appropriately, or this becomes a matter the probate court will need to examine formally, alongside today's disclosure about the farmhouse." Tyler looked between his mother and the lawyer, and for the first time that morning, he didn't say, "That's fair." He didn't say anything at all. I didn't stay for the rest of it. I gathered my coat, thanked Preston for his time, and told Diane and Tyler that any further conversation about the house, the transfers, Or the will could go through my own attorney from that point forward. Diane followed me into the hallway anyway, her heels sharp against the tile. "You're really going to do this? To your brother? To me? After everything I did for this family?" "You didn't do anything for this family," I said, turning to face her fully for what felt like the first time in years. "You did things that made this family easier to manage, easier to photograph, easier to describe at parties. That's not the same as doing something for us. And I think somewhere underneath all of it, you already know that. Robert would be ashamed of how this looks." Robert drove out to my kitchen every few weeks for 6 years. "Because it was the only place in his life where nobody was managing him," I said. "He sat at my table and worried out loud about a developer you invited to dinner to talk about subdividing his grandfather's land. I think he'd be ashamed of a lot of things that happened in this family. This isn't one of them. You've been planning this humiliation for years." "No," I said. "I've been protecting one honest thing in my life for 5 years. Quietly, the way my father asked me to. You're the one who scheduled a will reading you assumed I'd skip. I just happened to show up." I got in my car before she could answer. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the end of the driveway. Not from anger, exactly, but from the strange, hollow relief of finally saying out loud in front of witnesses things I had swallowed for 16 years. Diane did not go quietly. Within days, she was calling relatives, describing the farmhouse deed as a technicality my father had signed without understanding its consequences, hinting that his judgment had already begun slipping years earlier than anyone realized, implying, without quite saying it outright, that I'd taken advantage of a man in decline. It might have worked, if Preston hadn't already begun documenting the timeline. My father had passed a full cognitive evaluation 18 months after the deed was filed, as part of an unrelated insurance renewal. He'd renewed his contractor's license, unassisted, the year after that. He'd negotiated a property sale on his own the year before he died, a transaction Diane herself had bragged about at the time as evidence of how sharp he still was. Her own words undid her own argument. The probate court took the unauthorized transfers seriously once the formal petition was filed. Diane's attorney, recognizing the exposure, negotiated a settlement rather than risk a formal finding of financial exploitation, which would have carried far heavier consequences. She repaid a substantial portion of the transferred funds to the estate. She relinquished any further claim to contest the farmhouse deed. In exchange, she kept the marital home and her share of the will as originally written, along with whatever remained of her reputation among the extended family, which, as it turned out, was less than she expected. Word travels quietly through families like ours. Aunts who had once admired Diane's hosting began asking pointed questions at gatherings she wasn't invited to. My father's old business partner, who'd sat in that first meeting looking uncomfortable the entire time, later told me privately that he'd always sensed something performative about her, but had never had a reason, until now, to say so out loud. Tyler and I didn't speak for almost 4 months. He called eventually, not with an apology exactly, but with something that sounded like the beginning of one. "I think I agreed with her for so long that I forgot how to check whether she was actually right," he said. I said, "That's fair," before I even understood what I was agreeing to. "I've been thinking about that every day since." "Why do you think you did that?" I asked, genuinely curious, not looking for a fight. "Because agreeing with Diane was always easier than figuring out what I actually thought," he admitted. "It's easier to have opinions when someone else hands them to you already formed. I did that for 15 years and told myself it was called being close to my family. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that trust would take longer to rebuild than one honest phone call. No matter how much I meant that appreciation, he accepted that better than I expected him to. We started having coffee every few weeks, tentatively, the way you test a bridge you're not sure will hold your weight yet. He asked more questions now. He formed more of his own opinions, even when they were uncomfortable ones, even when they meant disagreeing with his mother out loud for the first time in his adult life. I moved into the farmhouse that following autumn. I found a small tin box in the back of my father's old workshop, tucked behind a shelf of hand tools he'd used to build half the furniture in that house himself. A letter he'd written the same week we filed the deed. In case, he wrote, "You ever need to explain this to people who won't understand it as a gift." "This house was never about keeping something from Diane," he wrote, in the same blunt, unpracticed handwriting he used for everything. "It was about giving something to you that no one could talk you out of, argue you out of, or manage you out of. You spent your whole life being the one nobody had to worry about, the one who never asked for anything, the one who made it easy for everyone else to focus on everyone else. I wanted you to have one thing in your life that was simply, quietly, entirely yours, with no one's name attached to it but your own. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that being easy isn't the same as being fine." I read that letter sitting on the same porch where he used to sit with his coffee, worrying out loud about a future he wouldn't be there to see. I read it again a week later, and again after the settlement was finalized, and I still read it sometimes now, on the anniversary of his death, when the house is quiet and the ladders are finally, permanently retired. I saw Diane once more, almost a year after the reading, at a mutual cousin's engagement party neither of us could easily avoid. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way she carried herself, as though the performance had finally cost more than it had ever paid out. "I know you think I only cared about the house," she said, catching me near the drink table, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I think you cared about being the version of yourself that a house like that made you look like," I said. "I don't think that's the same as caring about the house, and I definitely don't think it's the same as caring about my father." She didn't argue. She simply nodded once and walked away, and I understood that was as close to an honest exchange as we were ever going to have, and that it would have to be enough. People sometimes ask if I regret not fighting harder in that room, not saying more, not making Diane answer for every year of quiet exclusion in front of a full audience. I don't. I said the one sentence that mattered, and I let 5 years of quiet paperwork say the rest. I used to think loyalty meant staying quiet long enough for everyone else to feel comfortable. Now I know that silence protects the people who benefit from it, not the people who keep it. An inheritance is not a reward for being the easiest person in the room. Sometimes it's simply proof that someone was paying attention, patiently, quietly, for years, when nobody else in the family thought attention was necessary. If your family has already decided what you're owed, and decided it without ever asking you, that decision doesn't have to be the final word. Sometimes the truth has already been filed away quietly, in a folder, in a drawer, in a county office nobody thought to check, waiting for the one moment someone finally reads it out loud. We hope this story was both entertaining and meaningful. All situations are fictional, created only for reflection and entertainment. Your peace was never something others had to approve of. It was always yours to protect, and yours to build, quietly, one honest decision at a time, long before anyone else ever notices you've already made it.